Thank you for joining us for this sermon podcast from United Church on the Green, located in New Haven, Connecticut. No matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you are invited and welcome. If you enjoy this podcast and would like to learn more about our open and affirming ministry at United Church on the Green, please visit our website at unitednewhaven.org. Thank you.
Today's reading comes from the book of Jeremiah, chapter 29, beginning at verse 1, which can be found at page 731 of the Old Testament in your pew Bibles. These are the words of the letter that the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the remaining elders among the exiles, and to the priests, the prophets, and all the people whom Nebuchadnezzar had taken into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease. But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf. For in its welfare you will find your welfare. Brothers and sisters, God is still speaking. May our hearts and minds be open so that we may listen and understand.
Would you pray with me, please? Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your presence. For you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. 2.5 millennia ago, early in the 6th century BCE, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon was building an empire. Not content with his kingdom in the Fertile Crescent, what is now Iraq, he struck out into the surrounding lands and conquered the neighboring peoples, one after another after another. His armies were strong, and their empire grew, stretching hundreds of miles across the desert until they reached the land of Palestine on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. Jerusalem was smaller then than it is now, but it was a city in its own right that had its own king, and the people tried to fight. They struggled for decades. They withstood a siege and various kinds of attacks, but in the end, Nebuchadnezzar's forces were too strong. They deposed the king, sent much of the ruling class into exile in Babylon. In their place, they set up a sort of puppet government, a ruler who would be loyal to the Babylonians, but he got sick of it. He tried to rebel, and Nebuchadnezzar's armies came down hard. They ransacked the city of Jerusalem. They destroyed and desecrated the temple there. They sent the remaining rulers into exile. Other residents fled to Egypt to escape. It would be decades before they would be allowed to come home, decades more before they would be able to rebuild their city and their temple. This is the context in which the prophet Jeremiah lived and prophesied. In a world of political instability, perpetual warfare, and all kinds of uncertainty, Jeremiah tried to make sense of what was happening around him and to guide the people through the uncharted territory they faced. Jeremiah is often known as the weeping prophet because of his agonized, heartbroken laments over the fate of Jerusalem and her people. But in today's passage, Jeremiah is not weeping. Today's text is an excerpt from a letter written by Jeremiah and delivered by messengers to the exiles in Babylon. In it, Jeremiah does not pronounce judgment, but instead delivers a promise of restoration. In the verses that follow, the passage Al just read for us, Jeremiah offers God's promise to the people: this exile will not last forever. This time in a foreign land, the land of your captors, is not forever. There will come a time when your fortunes will be restored. There will come a time when you will go home again. My plans, says God, are for your welfare, not for harm, for a future full of hope and life. But before that, Jeremiah says words that I'm guessing the community of exiles did not want to hear. It's going to be a while. Long enough, he says, that the community needs to dig in for the long haul. Build houses, live in them, plant gardens and eat the produce, get married, have children. Don't hold out for some kind of magical fast rescue, and in so doing, let your community go without home, without food, without love. And then there's this: seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. This is a hard teaching. Not only does Jeremiah dash their hopes for immediate relief, but he tells them they have to care about the very people who conquered their homeland, who carried them into exile, who couldn't care a whit about them. They have to seek the welfare of the city to do what they can to contribute to its flourishing. They have to pray for the Babylonians. Now, if you've ever heard the widespread Christian myth that the Old Testament is about love and it is about judgment, and the New Testament is about love, that the Old Testament is exclusive and the New Testament is inclusive, this reading ought to go some distance toward debunking that idea. In fact, I wonder whether Jeremiah's letter to the exiles in Babylon might be one of the texts that formed Jesus. Being an observant Jew, well-versed in the scriptures of his people, I wonder if this message might have helped to shape Jesus' teaching. After all, it sure sounds like a foreshadowing of his call to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, does it not? This is a hard teaching, and it is one of the fundamental teachings of our faith, that the love of God and the love of beloved community extends not only to those we find it easy to love, but also to those we despise. Jeremiah teaches us that even if we find ourselves living among people who could not be more different from us or more indifferent to our well-being, even if we find ourselves living among people who are connected to those who have harmed us, who show no concern whatsoever for our flourishing, part of our job as God's people is to be a blessing to the community in which we find ourselves. We don't get to just dismiss, discard, condemn the people who disagree with us. We don't get to just write them off as enemies, unworthy of our concern or care or attention or understanding. We don't get to retaliate and hurt them as they have hurt us, for retribution does not actually lead to restoration, and restoration is what God is about. In their welfare, Jeremiah says, we will find our welfare. Our survival and well-being are inextricably intertwined with all the rest of God's children and God's creation. And that includes not only those who are vulnerable, but also those who are in power. Not only those who are being harmed, but also those who are inflicting the harm. This is a hard teaching. I don't really like preaching this sermon, to be perfectly honest with you. I could preach all day long about our connection with our siblings who are vulnerable, who are suffering, who are pushed to the margins by the powers that be. I could talk about solidarity and interdependence and the understanding that I cannot flourish while my sibling is hurting. It is much more difficult for me to remember that I am also connected to those who are perpetrating that hurt and harm against people I love, against me, by personal action, by institutional policy, that I have to pray for them too. This is a hard teaching, and it can be a dangerous one. It can be a small and all too slippery step from the call to seek the welfare of the city, to be a blessing to the community in which you find yourself, or a call to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, or the call we heard in last Sunday's reading to forgive those who sin against us over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. It can be a small and all too slippery step from those calls to a call for abused spouses to stay with their abusers, to a call for enslaved persons to obey their masters, to a call for employees experiencing harassment to keep quiet so they won't hurt their coworkers or the organization. But this call to seek the welfare of even those who have carried you into exile is not, let me say, is not a call to submit or comply with your own or another's harm. This call to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you is not a call to passive obedience in the face of hurt or injustice. I want you to hear this really clearly. This is not an endorsement of oppressive systems or interpersonal harm. The Hebrew word that's translated here as welfare, as in seek the welfare of the city, that word is shalom. And shalom, as you may know, means peace, but it is not a watered-down, papered-over peace where the appearance of harmony is maintained by the silent suffering of many. It is the wholeness, a fullness, and all-encompassing well-being and completeness. In the words of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., it is not a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, but a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. Shalom does not mean we tolerate hurt or harm to any part of God's family in the name of keeping the peace. To seek the shalom of the city must necessarily include resistance to all that would work against the positive peace, which is the presence of justice. It must necessarily include the work of speaking truth to power. It must necessarily include the work of dismantling the systems of violence, domination, and oppression that harm every member of our society. For these systems of injustice do not harm only those of us who are pushed to the margins along one or more axes. They harm everyone. They diminish the humanity of everyone. They poison the souls of everyone. And so the call to the work of shalom is a call to everyone, too. If we hear this teaching from the perspective of the Israelites, taken into exile and living among their captors, this message calls us to resist being defined by the harm that has been done to us, and to claim or reclaim our agency and our identity as people of God, in spite of all that has been done, all the ways that individuals or systems have oppressed us. We can yet choose a response rooted in love, wholeness, shalom. We do not have to be pulled down to the level of hate that infuses so much of the functioning of our society. We can live out of a love that is subversive, a love that transforms us and our oppressors and the whole of God's creation. But when that messenger arrived in Babylon bearing the words Jeremiah had sent from Jerusalem, when he proclaimed that message in the midst of the city, he did it out loud. Most people were not literate, and so the Israelites were not the only ones who heard it. This teaching has a message for the Babylonian captors as well. And if we hear it from their perspective, it calls us to reconsider the ways in which we are part of contributing to the harm of those who are in exile in our midst. It convicts us of the ways in which we participate in systems that keep some of God's people, and therefore all of us, from full wholeness, full well-being, full shalom. And the reality is, none of us is only the Israelites or only the Babylonians. None of us is only the exiles or only the captors. None of us is only the oppressed or only the oppressor. For me, as a white person, I recognize that I carry racial privilege in this society, that I am safe in spaces where my best friend, who is a woman of color, is not safe. At the same time, as a woman myself, I'm vigilant moving through the world because society has taught men that they can exert their will over my body and my spirit. At the same time, as a cisgender person, I am not subject to the trauma that our transgender siblings endure, to people's verbal and physical attempts to make my gender expression fit the categories into which someone has decided I should fit. You understand where I'm going with this. Every one of us carries our own set of identities and experiences, some of which place us in positions of power, others of which make us vulnerable. And the call to seek the welfare of the city is a call for all of us in all the complexities of those intersecting identities, powerful and vulnerable, centered and marginalized, hurting and healing. God calls every one of us and every part of every one of us to the sacred work of building beloved community, to the holy labor of seeking shalom for ourselves, for our loved ones, for our families, for our neighbors, for our friends, and even, yes, for our enemies. For we are one body with many members. And it's going to take all of us together to bend the arc of this universe toward the justice, the love, the shalom that all of us need and that God has promised. Amen.